from an aquatic system, an offshore system, drag your nets, bring the material out, separate it, dry the tissues, analyze it, reconstruct the community and ecosystem through that type of analysis. Spectacular probe for analyzing these types of systems. Carbon can be used similarly. They all have all these elements and different isotopes, strontium, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen. They all can tell you different things about these communities and ecosystems. And we would be remiss not to have brought it up at all because of its contemporary importance in ecology. You've all been introduced to cycles like this in high school biology at some point. We'll just review them and hit some of the important points that we'll be using in the next couple lectures. We'll focus on the three elements of nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon, and of course water, in thinking about how these materials cycle on a global scale. Water, remember, is primarily, on Earth, is primarily in the oceans. So you can look at these numbers just for purposes of thinking about quantities, relatively speaking. You certainly don't need to remember anything about these actual numbers, but the units are in grams. Some exponential, there are grams, 10 to the 18 grams here. So there's a lot of water in the oceans relative to other parts of the Earth. The next biggest compartment is just in groundwater, in the water beneath, in subterranean water. One thing to note here is that the water that evaporates off the oceans and ultimately contributes to the atmosphere precipitates back over the oceans in some measure, but when you subtract one from the other, you realize there's a remainder, and that remainder is the moisture that's transported over land and is available as precipitation. There's a lot of water locked into ice and snow, about the same amount that's in the ground. So your glaciers and your mountain glaciers and your polar glacial ice contains a lot of water. And the land also evapotranspires water back into the atmosphere, and that can be cycled back and reprecipitated over land. But ultimately, this water is going to run through the various aquatic biomes and systems back to the ocean, right? Probably familiar with that, but maybe not in that detail. How about nitrogen? A couple things to understand about nitrogen. It's primarily on Earth in the atmosphere. What is the atmosphere? 80% nitrogen? And so there's a ton of it. But the problem is it's not available to organisms in that gaseous form. Organisms can't take up gaseous nitrogen and use it. So the only way organisms can use it is if it's fixed, if that nitrogen is fixed into usable form, usually in the form of ammonia. So biological nitrogen fixation plays a major role in connecting that atmospheric pool to the available pool for organisms. There's just natural atmospheric deposition. The nitrogen can be fixed by lightning in water. Lightning strikes on water can fix nitrogen, but biological nitrogen fixation plays the predominating role in making it available to organisms. But look what's happened with human activities. It was a major revolution when humans figured out how to fix nitrogen industrially, mimicking what many autotrophs do. So this industrial nitrogen fixation rivals biological, natural fixation in how much of that is actually occurring. Add to that this quantity of agricultural fixation, the planting of crops that are nitrogen fixers, like many legumes. Many legumes, those types of crops, have the nodules in their roots that harbor the bacteria that fix nitrogen. In a mutualism, these plants harbor the bacteria that are nitrogen fixers. And the planting of those crops accelerates nitrogen fixation on a global scale because we've replaced non-nitrogen fixing systems with nitrogen fixing systems, in addition to industrially fixing nitrogen and incorporating it into fertilizers that are spread onto agricultural systems to stimulate growth, because nitrogen is such a limiting factor for so many plants and ecosystems. And much of that nitrogen flows off the system it's applied to as excess and downstream, which is such a big part of these environmental problems we face. You do something here, it affects people and organisms over there. And that's the case with nitrogen. Nitrogen is such a limiting nutrient that it gets into other systems and can cause problems. Just another view of the nitrogen cycle to highlight a couple of things more locally within the system, how nitrogen in the atmosphere can be fixed by bacteria in the soil, in the nodules of plant roots. You'll get into that in botany, how that process works. And then via those types of fixation, usually bacterial fixation, it can enter the dynamics of the local community. And there are bacteria that denitrify these nitrates and send them back to the atmosphere. So bacteria can also play a role in losing the nitrogen back to an unusable form in the atmosphere. So we grow these leguminous crops, not necessarily in this case, but we grow them and we apply the fertilizers, the nitrogen-rich fertilizers, and they have a wonderful effect on productivity in your local plot, on your farm. But as it rains, just like you saw with the clear cut, I mean, maybe this was forest at one point. There's trees in the background. These fields were probably cleared of a different vegetation type, and that can influence the whole erosion pattern, similar to what you saw in Hubbard Brook. Well, much of this nitrogen that gets applied exists in excess and flows out of the system. And if you think about the Gulf of Mexico and all of the farming that occurs up the Mississippi and in this whole region, so much of the materials applied to those farms flow downstream and end up in the Gulf of Mexico, where they influence these marine ecosystems. All that runoff, all that nitrate runoff, all the nitrogen runoff, all the other additives in the fertilizers, all the pollutants, they end up in the Gulf. And what does that do in the marine systems? Well, it stimulates growth of autotrophs in the marine systems. So the autotrophs in the marine systems undergo blooms because their limiting nutrients like nitrogen are being elevated. And when these organisms bloom and grow rapidly and die rapidly at high rates, they decompose at high rates. And the decomposition process requires oxygen. The decomposition process and cellular respiration takes up oxygen. And so these systems get oxygen starved when they get nutrient loaded. And so in the winter, with the reds indicating low oxygen levels, you see that the very near shore system may be somewhat oxygen starved. But in summer, as it heats up, much bigger regions become oxygen depleted with the blooming of the phytoplankton, the autotrophs, with the nutrient input as it flows out. And that can challenge these systems. The fish, the shellfish, it's a major oyster producing region, major shellfish producing region. And those organisms need oxygen. And when they get oxygen starved, the whole industry based on oysters and fish can run into trouble. So the fishermen here are affected by the farmers here in very significant ways. And add to that insults like this. I mean, it's only been a couple of years, but do you remember the huge oil spill that happened here? Add insults to injuries, and you have a system that is really, really struggling to maintain its health. And as a consequence, the health of the food products that it generates, or the tourism, forget the business of tourism that's so important there. Add a hurricane or two, and my gosh, you have a system that's really facing major problems. Phosphorus, I just want to draw a contrast with nitrogen, for example. In the way it cycles globally, there's no major gaseous atmospheric pool for phosphorus. Its cycle is basically local. It's derived from the weathering of rocks, from the erosion of rocks as they're uplifted and exposed through tectonic forces. Exposed and eroded out, the phosphorus becomes loosened and available and gets into these systems on those timescales, those long timescales, and then isn't very mobile. It binds to the soil particles and tends to remain locally within systems. Sure, it can flow downstream and out of the system, but that's pretty much balanced by the weathering of rocks within the system. So you get these local cycles of phosphorus, another really critical element for organismal growth and success. And another one that plays a big role in creating blooms in aquatic environments. A famous case, this is another one that sometimes a study just catches the attention of the public at the right moment and really can change our culture. This was a case of that late 60s or early 70s when environmental issues were starting to enter people's consciousness. The first Earth Day in 1970, after all the cultural upheaval of the 60s, people were starting to become much more sensitive to environmental issues. And a study up in Canada just hit it at the right time and really influenced the political climate and led to political changes related to this. Well, all these guys did, very simple, take a lake that you could divide from the one side from the other in these experimental lakes and supplement one side with an element like phosphorus and monitor the changes. What does the role of phosphorus play in these ecosystems that are phosphorus limited? Well, what it led to were huge blooms of autotrophs and the concomitant depletion of oxygen and the killing of the fish and the higher trophic levels as a result of phosphorus input. Well, at that time, laundry detergents and many household cleaners were full of phosphates, and people would be, pouring their phosphates down their drains, in their dishwasher, in their sinks, in their laundry machines in particular, and all that's running off into the local waterways and into the oceans. And the results are like this. And the politicians took one look. I mean, you just need to see a picture like that and be told, look, phosphorus was put in there. Look, all your laundry detergent has tons of phosphates. Phosphorus. Look, that stuff gets into the waterways. It's killing systems that it gets into. And the legislation was, pushed through quickly, and phosphates, it was regulated. The amount of phosphates in different detergents was regulated, and household supplies was pretty simple. And we didn't have a shortage of laundry detergent in subsequent years or something like that. They just changed the content, and our clothes still get clean enough, sure. And it had a great impact on these ecosystems, just the limiting of phosphorus in such products. There is incredible misunderstanding on some of these subjects. And we're going to talk about the carbon cycle, and you'll be able to understand it well, I think, in the context of everything else we've looked at, how carbon flows through the global ecosystem, how it flows locally through systems, and the role of carbon in the global climate. I'll be talking about this more next week, but I'm going to introduce some of the basics now, because I don't want to rush it. We're here with the last 5 minutes, so hang in there. Quick stretch if you need to try to understand this. Don't waste your time and not listen, because you'll just have to learn it later. This stuff will be on the exam. And it's good as a good earthling for you to know about some of these processes, in their scientific basis, because there's not much controversy on this subject in biology, in climatology, in terms of the basics here. There's broad agreement about the basics. Take it into popular culture, and the agreement evaporates. And perspectives are highly correlated with political positions, political persuasions, and all of those discussions and dynamics really don't touch back on the science, which is just straightforward and Carbon Basics 101, really not controversial at all. So I'm just going to tell you the basics about this scientifically. And when we look at carbon, we can look at the major pools in which carbon is stored on Earth. And the big pool for carbon is in the rocks and in the fossil fuels on Earth. The vast majority of carbon on Earth is contained subterraneanly in rocks and fossil fuel deposits. And there are these various fluxes within the biosphere, within the living system of carbon, similar to the way we've looked at it before. Plants take up carbon dioxide, right? Here, in gross primary production, plants take up carbon dioxide. But organisms respire carbon dioxide during cellular respiration. So there's some balance there between what plants take up and what organisms respire. There's a relative balance in that system. And there's a certain poetic beauty that's always been referred to in that, where the plants take up the carbon dioxide and release the oxygen, and we breathe in the oxygen and release the carbon dioxide that the plants take up. So there's that nice interrelationship between autotrophs and heterotrophs in that sense. That's part of the dynamic, but those numbers pale in comparison to these other pools that exist. Dissolved carbon in the ocean waters and the amount stored subterranean. And just another view of the carbon cycle for you to look at, to take a second look. Those fossil fuel deposits, did you know? We call them fossil fuels because they are derived from the remains of ancient organisms. It's easier to talk about this after you've had your botany, but you have a sense of the geological timescale now from the evolution section. 300 million years ago, long before the dinosaurs, in the Carboniferous, you had these great pteridophyte forests, these forests of relatives of ferns and lycophytes and things that grew to tree sizes, grew to great scale, and grew so productively that and these systems had such little turnover, decomposition rates were so low in these systems, that when these organisms grew and fell, they tended to pile up and form these massive deposits of biological remains that piled up in these swampy, wetland-type environments and formed these tremendous deposits of biological tissue that over time, upon being sequestered in the earth and altered metamorphically, led to the fossil fuel deposits that exist today. And why are the fossil fuel deposits so rich in carbon? Because these organisms, way back then, took up all that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, locked it in their own tissues, which fell into these deposits and became fossilized. They're carbon rich because these organisms are carbon-based life forms, and the fossil fuel deposits are derived from them. It's pretty amazing. So that's why they're so carbon rich, the fossil fuels. And that's why burning of fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and oil, leads to so much carbon loss from the terrestrial system and carbon input into the atmosphere. Please wrestle with these diagrams. I'll outline them a little bit more next week, and we'll look at the role of carbon in influencing solar radiation.